Slavery is often explained as exploitation, hard labor, cruel masters, endless work under the sun. But there is a quieter truth that almost never makes it into classrooms or documentaries. Some enslaved people were never meant to survive long enough to be exploited. Before we go any further, if you're new to this channel, subscribe for history they never wanted questioned. Tell us where you're watching from and the time in your location. This is a community, and your voice belongs here. So relax, sit back. You are at the right place, at the right time, and for the right story. Now let's begin. That story is comforting. It allows people to believe cruelty was incidental, that death was a consequence, not a strategy. But when you begin to look closely at records, at numbers, at the environments enslaved people were sent into, that explanation collapses. Because there were places where survival was not expected, places where death was not a failure of the system, it was the system. To understand this, you have to unlearn something. First, slavery was not one thing. It was not a single uniform experience, stretching neatly across centuries and continents. It was a collection of systems designed for different purposes, operating under the same logic: profit, control, and disposability. Plantation slavery, what most people picture, was only one version. And even there, conditions varied wildly. But beyond the plantations existed another category, a darker one, rarely discussed, carefully softened over time. These were spaces where enslaved people were sent not to live and work for decades, but to be consumed quickly, worked until their bodies failed, replaced without ceremony, forgotten without records. And the reason you don't hear about them often is simple. They challenged the idea that slavery was merely about labor. They force us to confront something harder, that for many enslaved people, death was cheaper than care. The story most people grow up with is simple. Enslaved Africans were forced to work. Their labor was stolen. Their lives were brutal. But the goal, so we're told, was productivity. Keep them alive just enough to keep them working. The systems that ran slavery were not chaotic. They were calculated. Ledgers mattered. Expenses were tracked. Losses were measured. And when you study those ledgers, a pattern emerges. In certain environments, mines, swamps, islands, punishment camps, disease-ridden zones, enslaved people were treated as expendable inputs. Their expected lifespan was short, sometimes shockingly short, not because overseers didn't know how to keep people alive, but because keeping them alive was not the goal. Replacement was cheaper. If a body could be worked for months or a few years at maximum output before collapsing, and if another body could be purchased or captured to take its place, the system didn't consider that inefficiency. It considered that optimization. This is where the lie begins to unravel, because once you accept that some enslaved people were deliberately placed into conditions where death was inevitable, the narrative changes. Slavery stops being only a story of stolen labor and becomes something closer to managed destruction. And that idea makes people uncomfortable. It challenges national myths. It challenges moral distance. It challenges the idea that history simply didn't know better, but the people running these systems knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that certain climates destroyed bodies quickly. They knew that certain workloads guaranteed collapse. They knew that certain diets could not sustain life under extreme labor, and they chose those conditions anyway. Not everywhere, not always, but often enough that it cannot be dismissed as accident. One of the most dangerous misconceptions about slavery is the belief that brutality was random, that it came from cruelty alone. Cruelty existed, yes, but cruelty does not explain consistency. Systems do. And systems leave traces. You find those traces in shipping records, that list replacement purchases more carefully than deaths, in correspondence complaining not about mortality but about supply delays, in calculations that assume a body will last a certain number of seasons. No more, you find them in silence too, because the places where enslaved people were worked to death by design are the places history mentions least, not because they were insignificant, but because they are inconvenient. They complicate the story. They show that slavery was not just sustained by violence, but by indifference, by a willingness to accept death as an acceptable operating cost. And once death becomes acceptable, it stops being remarkable. That's why these histories were softened after abolition. It was easier to frame slavery as cruel labor than to admit that, in many cases, it functioned like a slow, decentralized extermination system. There were no dramatic mass executions, no single moments of spectacle, just relentless attrition. Bodies broken one by one, names lost, replacement after replacement, and because the dead rarely left testimony, their absence became the evidence. To be clear, this story is not about exaggeration. It is not about claiming that all enslaved people were worked to death everywhere. That would be dishonest. This story is about specificity, about acknowledging that within slavery existed zones of death spaces where the expected outcome was not survival, but collapse. And once you see that, you start to notice something else. The people sent into these conditions were often those deemed most disposable, the rebellious, the newly captured, those considered unmanageable, those whose bodies were already weakened. Slavery sorted people, and at the bottom of that sorting system were those sent into environments where the system quietly accepted that they would not last, not because no one cared, but because the system cared about something else: more efficiency, profit control. This is why the phrase "worked to death" matters. Not as metaphor, as policy. The tragedy is not just that people died, it's that their deaths were anticipated, absorbed, and then forgotten. In the scenes that follow, we will move slowly and carefully through this history. We will look at the environments where survival was statistically unlikely, at the economics that rewarded rapid exhaustion over long-term survival, at the records that reveal intent without ever stating it outright. We will not rely on shock. We will rely on evidence, because the truth here is not loud. It is quiet, administrative, buried in assumptions. And once you see it, it changes how you understand slavery forever. This first scene is not meant to overwhelm you. It is meant to unsettle you just enough to ask a different question. Not how hard were enslaved people worked, but why were so many placed into conditions where work could only end one way? That question will guide everything that follows. And by the end of this story, the phrase "worked to death" will no longer sound like exaggeration. It will sound like a description. The question from the end of the last scene does not end there. It opens a door. Slavery did not function as a single machine operating the same way everywhere. It was not one uniform experience governed by a single rulebook. It was a collection of systems, each engineered for a specific purpose, and understanding that difference is essential to understanding why so many enslaved people were worked to death by design. The version of slavery most people recognize is plantation slavery. Long rows of crops, forced labor from sunrise to sunset, brutal discipline, but with an underlying assumption that the enslaved worker would be kept alive long enough to remain productive. That assumption, while cruel in itself, was not universal. It only applied where long-term labor made economic sense. Elsewhere, enslavement followed a different logic. In these systems, the goal was not sustained productivity across decades. The goal was extraction at maximum intensity over the shortest possible time. These were places where the body was treated as a consumable resource, not an investment. This distinction matters because without it, the deaths of millions are misinterpreted as accidental, when in reality they were often structural. The enslaving powers of the early modern world understood geography. They understood climate. They understood how disease, exhaustion, and malnutrition interacted with labor. They also understood cost, and in many environments, the cost of keeping an enslaved person alive exceeded the cost of replacing them. That calculation reshaped slavery into multiple tiers. At the top were enslaved people placed in systems where reproduction and longevity were encouraged. This did not mean safety or humanity. It meant efficiency. Enslaved women were forced to give birth not for family, but for supply. Children were raised as future labor units. Life expectancy was still brutally low, but survival beyond childhood was at least possible. Below that were systems where reproduction was irrelevant because replacement came from elsewhere. These systems relied on constant inflows of newly captured or purchased people. They were designed around turnover. Death was expected, and the system was structured to absorb it. And at the bottom were the zones of near-certain death. These were not accidents of cruelty. They were deliberate placements into environments where survival rates were known to be minimal. Mines, deep swamps, disease-ridden coastlines, isolated islands, punishment camps. These were not fringe locations. They were central to imperial economies. Sugar, for example, was not a plantation fantasy. It was an industrial operation that destroyed bodies rapidly. The work was relentless. The heat was suffocating. The tools were dangerous. The air was thick with smoke and particulate matter. Enslaved people in these environments did not live long, and the system did not pretend otherwise. This is where the idea of slavery as a single experience collapses, because the conditions were not random, they were matched to purpose. If the goal was long-term agricultural output, conditions were adjusted to preserve minimal functionality. If the goal was rapid extraction, conditions were intensified until bodies failed. The enslavers did not need to state this openly. The records say it for them. In correspondence between overseers and owners, complaints rarely focus on death itself. They focus on shortages, on delays in replacement, on disruptions to workflow. Death appears only as a logistical inconvenience, never as a moral crisis. This tells us something important. When a system treats death as background noise, it means death has been normalized, and normalization only happens when outcomes are expected. Another misconception that needs to be dismantled here is the idea that the most brutal forms of slavery were caused by emotional cruelty alone. That overseers were simply sadistic. That violence was spontaneous and unplanned. Cruel individuals existed, but cruelty alone does not explain consistency. Systems do. When enslaved people across different regions, different decades, and different empires died at similar rates under similar conditions, it stops being coincidence. It becomes design. This is why the phrase, "worked to death," should not be understood as exaggeration. It should be understood as classification. There were enslaved people who worked harshly and expected to survive, and there were enslaved people who worked harshly with no expectation of survival. The difference lay not in their humanity, but in their assigned function. Those assigned to death-bound systems were often newly captured Africans. They had not been seasoned. They had not been acclimated. They were considered expendable. They were sent where the work was hardest and the survival window shortest. This was not ignorance. It was intentional. Enslavers knew that newly captured people were more likely to die. They knew the stress, malnutrition, and disease of forced transport weakened bodies. They sent them anyway because their deaths did not threaten the system. The system anticipated loss. This is where economic logic overtakes moral language. From the perspective of the enslaving economy, a person who died after 1 year of extreme labor could still be profitable if their output exceeded their purchase cost. This calculation appears again and again in records. It is never framed as murder, it is framed as return on investment. Once this logic takes hold, the system begins to favor environments where intensity is maximized. This is why certain locations developed reputations among the enslaved as places of no return. These reputations were not myths. They were statistical realities. People whispered about them, not as abstract fears, but as warnings. If you were sent there, you did not plan for a future. And yet, modern history often collapses all of this into a single narrative of cruelty. It flattens the distinctions. It treats death as a tragic side effect rather than a planned outcome. This flattening is not accidental, it protects comfort, because acknowledging that some enslaved people were placed into systems designed for death forces a confrontation with intent. It forces us to admit that these were not systems that simply failed to value life. They were systems that calculated life away, and once that is admitted, the moral distance between slavery and later exterminatory systems becomes uncomfortably small. That comparison makes people uneasy, so history softens the language. Instead of designed for death, we hear harsh conditions. Instead of expendable, we hear overworked. Instead of replacement economy, we hear labor shortage. Words matter. They shape what we are willing to see and what we are willing to excuse. Another layer to this system was punishment. Slavery required discipline, but discipline took different forms depending on the value assigned to the enslaved person. In systems where long-term labor was desired, punishment was calibrated to break resistance without destroying functionality. In systems designed for rapid extraction, punishment was unconstrained. Bodies could be pushed beyond recovery because recovery was never expected. This is why resistance often resulted not in reform, but in relocation. Those deemed rebellious or disruptive were sent away, not because they were dangerous, but because they were no longer considered worth preserving. Disposal masqueraded as discipline. This sorting mechanism ensured that the most brutal environments were populated by those the system had already written off. Again, this was not random, it was management. What makes this difficult to accept is that it reframes responsibility. It shows that death was not merely tolerated, it was anticipated, and anticipation requires foresight. Which brings us to the records. Slavery was documented obsessively. Expenses, output, mortality, all tracked, but the language is telling. Rarely do records say, "These people died because we worked them too hard." Instead, they say, "Losses were high this season," or "Replacement costs increased," or "Productivity declined due to illness." The absence of moral language is not neutrality, it is evidence of normalization. When a system can describe mass death without urgency, it means death is not disrupting its goals. That is the core truth of this scene. Slavery was not one system, it was many, and within those systems existed spaces where death was not a risk, but a certainty. The next step is to look directly at the logic that made those spaces profitable, because once you understand why death could be economically rational, you understand why it was allowed to continue for centuries, and why even after abolition, the memory of these systems had to be softened, blurred, or erased, because acknowledging them would require admitting something devastating, that some enslaved people were not just exploited, they were consumed. And the system knew it. At a certain point, slavery stopped being about endurance and became about output, not how long a person could be kept alive, but how much could be taken from them before their body failed. This shift did not happen overnight. It emerged gradually as enslaving systems expanded, industrialized, and learned from experience. Over time, enslavers began to understand something grim but useful. There were environments where human beings could be pushed past recovery faster than they could be replaced, and environments where replacement was so easy that recovery no longer mattered. That realization changed everything. In these systems, death was no longer an unfortunate outcome. It was a predictable stage in the process, and once death becomes predictable, it becomes manageable. The enslaving economies of the Atlantic world were not improvised. They were planned, measured, and constantly adjusted. Plantation owners, mine operators, and colonial administrators kept records with obsessive precision. They tracked yields, labor hours, and expenses. They also tracked losses. What they did not do was panic when those losses were high. Instead, they adjusted supply. This is the clearest sign that death had been absorbed into the business model. If enslaved people were dying faster than expected, the solution was not to reduce workloads or improve conditions. The solution was to increase imports, to shorten replacement cycles, to recalculate profit margins. The body was not the constant. The output was. This logic is especially visible in industries that demanded extreme physical labor under deadly conditions. Sugar production is the most well-documented example, but it was not the only one. Sugar was relentless. Cane had to be cut quickly. Mills ran continuously. Boilers burned day and night. The heat was suffocating. Injuries were common. Recovery time was minimal or non-existent. Enslaved people working in these systems were pushed at a pace their bodies could not sustain for long. Contemporary observers, some of them enslavers themselves, acknowledged that life expectancy in these environments was short, and yet production continued. Why? Because the system did not depend on survival. It depended on throughput. If an enslaved person could survive 1 or 2 harvest seasons and produce more value than their purchase and maintenance cost, the system considered that success, even if death followed shortly after. This is not speculation, it is visible in population data. In many of the most profitable slave economies, enslaved populations did not grow naturally, they declined. The only reason they remained stable or increased was constant importation of new people. A system that destroys its workforce faster than it reproduces is not malfunctioning. It is consuming, and consumption requires replacement. This is why enslavers preferred environments where supply lines remained open. As long as ships arrived, bodies could be replaced. As long as replacement was possible, death was tolerable. In this context, medical care was not designed to preserve life. It was designed to restore function temporarily. A worker injured today needed to be functional tomorrow, not healthy next year. Once an injury became chronic, once illness reduced productivity permanently, the calculation changed. Care stopped making sense. That person was no longer an asset. They became a cost. This is where the moral language collapses completely, because the system did not ask whether a person deserved to live. It asked whether keeping them alive was efficient. The answer, in many cases, was no. This is why rations were calculated so carefully. They were rarely generous. They were calibrated to sustain labor at the lowest possible cost. Hunger was not a mistake, it was a management tool. A hungry body is weaker, but it is also more compliant. A starving body will collapse faster, but collapse was already accounted for. Everything about these systems points to intention without confession. No document says, work them until they die, but every document assumes death will occur. That assumption is the evidence. Another factor that made this model viable was psychological distance. Many of the people who profited most from slavery never saw the environments where enslaved people died in such numbers. They saw sugar, tobacco, cotton, and wealth. They did not see collapsed bodies. They did not hear final breaths. Distance allowed abstraction. Abstraction allowed rationalization. And rationalization allowed the system to continue without moral reckoning. This is also why some of the deadliest forms of enslaved labor were hidden from public view. Mines were underground. Islands were isolated. Swamps were inaccessible. Punishment zones were deliberately remote. Out of sight meant out of conscience. The further removed the violence, the easier it was to deny intent. But the enslaved understood this reality clearly. They knew which assignments meant survival and which meant disappearance. They knew which locations were whispered about as final destinations. These were not rumors. They were patterns observed over time. When people fear being sent somewhere more than they fear punishment, it tells you everything about that place. The business model depended on fear as much as labor. Fear kept people compliant. Fear kept resistance localized. Fear ensured that the most dangerous environments were staffed by those the system had already decided were expendable. This is where slavery reveals its most disturbing truth. It was not sustained by ignorance. It was sustained by calculation. When abolitionist pressure eventually threatened the supply of new enslaved people, the system reacted, not with remorse, but with adaptation. Suddenly, conditions improved in some regions. Life expectancy increased. Reproduction was encouraged, not because the system became more humane, but because death had become inconvenient. This shift proves something critical. The system always had the capacity to change. It simply chose not to when replacement was easy. That choice is the heart of this scene, because it means that for generations, enslaved people died, not because survival was impossible, but because survival was unnecessary to the system. Death was cheaper. Death was manageable. Death was built in. And once death becomes part of the design, it stops being recognized as violence. It becomes the background. In the next scene, we will leave abstraction behind and move into specific places, mines, islands, swamps, and camps, where this business model operated with brutal clarity, places where people were sent knowing they would not return. If death was part of the design, then geography was the tool that made it unavoidable. Enslaving systems did not rely on cruelty alone. They relied on placement, on knowing exactly where the human body would fail fastest and sending people there deliberately. These places were not chosen by accident. They were selected because nature itself could be turned into an accomplice. Heat, disease, isolation, exhaustion. Together they did what whips and chains alone could not. Across the enslaved world, certain locations developed reputations. Among enslavers, they were known as difficult postings, expensive, dangerous, high turnover. Among the enslaved, they were known as places you did not return from. The difference between those two perspectives tells you everything. Mines were among the most lethal of these environments. Underground labor stripped the body in ways surface work could not. Enslaved people were forced into narrow shafts with little ventilation, inhaling toxic dust day after day. Oxygen was scarce, heat was constant, cave-ins were common. The work required strength the body could not sustain for long. Muscles failed, lungs collapsed, infections spread in the darkness. Life expectancy in many mining operations was measured in months, not years. And yet, enslavers continued to send people there. Why? Because mines produced immense wealth quickly. Precious metals extracted in short bursts could outweigh the cost of dozens of lives. The system did not need miners to survive long. It needed them to dig deeply enough. Once their bodies failed, replacements were brought in. The same logic applied to swamps. Swamps were deadly, not because they were naturally hostile, but because they combined labor with disease. Enslaved people were sent to drain wetlands, clear land, and build infrastructure in mosquito-infested environments where malaria and yellow fever were endemic. Food was scarce. Clean water was rarer. Medical treatment was nearly non-existent. People weakened quickly. Fever followed. Death was common. These assignments were often framed as temporary, but everyone knew what that meant. Temporary did not mean survivable, it meant expendable. Enslaved people sent into swamps were often those already marked as disposable. New arrivals, the sick, the rebellious, the troublesome. If they survived, it was considered a bonus. If they died, it was considered expected. Islands represented another category of disappearance. Isolated by water, cut off from escape, islands were ideal locations for punishment zones and extreme labor camps. Supplies were limited. Oversight was minimal. Communication with the outside world was slow. This isolation created conditions where mortality could rise without drawing attention. On islands, enslaved people were forced to perform the most demanding labor under constant exposure to wind, salt, and cold or oppressive heat. Depending on the region, shelter was inadequate. Clothing was insufficient, and once illness or injury struck, there was nowhere to go. These were places where death did not disrupt production. It simply reduced headcount. The system absorbed the loss. Then there were the camps, not camps as people imagine them today, with fixed infrastructure and permanent populations, but temporary holding zones, punishment camps, and labor camps designed to break bodies quickly. People were sent there after resistance, escape attempts, or insubordination. The official purpose was discipline. The real function was removal. These camps were not designed to rehabilitate. They were designed to exhaust. Labor was relentless. Food was scarce. Disease spread rapidly. The environment did the rest. Survival was rare enough to reinforce fear. The message was clear. Resistance did not lead to reform. It led to disappearance. What connects all of these places is not just brutality. It is knowledge. Enslavers knew these environments were deadly. They did not stumble into this reality. Mortality rates were observed, discussed, and accounted for. Yet people were sent there anyway. That fact alone tells us this was not neglect. It was selection. Another common thread was invisibility. These places were deliberately positioned away from centers of oversight. Mines were underground. Swamps were inaccessible. Islands were isolated. Camps were temporary and poorly documented. When people died there, their deaths did not provoke scrutiny. No one demanded explanations. No one expected survivors. This invisibility allowed the system to function without interruption. It also allowed history to forget. Because when death leaves few witnesses and fewer records, it becomes easier to reframe later, to describe these environments as unfortunate rather than intentional. But among the enslaved, memory worked differently. They knew which places destroyed people fastest. They shared this knowledge quietly, through warnings and whispers. These locations became symbolic, not just of suffering but of finality. Being sent there meant the system had decided you were no longer worth preserving. This is where the idea of worked to death becomes more than a phrase. It becomes spatial. Death was not evenly distributed across slavery. It clustered, and it clustered in places designed to consume human bodies at accelerated rates. The system relied on this clustering. It allowed enslavers to maintain the illusion that most enslaved people survived, while quietly sacrificing others in the margins. Those margins are where the truth lives. Because when you map where enslaved people died most frequently, you are not mapping accidents. You are mapping intent. In the next scene, we will look at time, at how long enslaved people were expected to live in these environments, and how life expectancy itself became a calculated variable. Because when a system knows roughly how long a body will last, and proceeds anyway, the line between exploitation and extermination becomes impossible to ignore. Once enslaved people were placed into these environments, time itself became part of the calculation. Not time as humans experience it, years, futures, aging, but time as a measurable window of usefulness. How long could a body endure before it failed? That question sat quietly beneath every decision the system made. Enslavers did not speak openly about life expectancy, but they behaved as if they understood it well. They planned operations around it. They adjusted supply around it. They absorbed death around it. And that is the clearest sign that survival was never the priority. In many of the most lethal systems, enslaved people were expected to last only a short period. Sometimes a few years, sometimes far less. This expectation was not hidden. It appeared indirectly in records, correspondence, and demographic patterns. Populations that should have grown instead shrank. Birth rates failed to offset deaths. Children were rare, not because people were incapable of reproduction, but because conditions made sustained family life impossible. This alone tells us something crucial. A population that cannot reproduce itself is being destroyed faster than it can regenerate. That does not happen accidentally. In plantation systems designed for long-term labor, enslavers invested reluctantly and minimally in reproduction. Women were forced to bear children, infants were raised to become future workers. Survival, however harsh, was still part of the plan. But in the most brutal environments, reproduction was irrelevant. Why raise children in a place where adults barely survived? Why allow pregnancy when every day of labor mattered? Why invest in life when death was already accounted for? In these systems, enslaved people were not expected to age. They were expected to expire. This expectation shaped everything. Workloads were set at levels that pushed the body to its limits immediately. There was no gradual conditioning, no adaptation period. People were thrown into extreme labor as soon as they arrived. Rest was minimal. Recovery was rare. Injuries were treated only if they promised a quick return to work. Once an injury became chronic, once it reduced output permanently, that person was no longer worth maintaining. The system did not see a human being. It saw diminishing returns. Food rations tell a similar story. They were not designed to nourish. They were designed to sustain just enough strength to continue labor for the shortest viable window. Enslaved people were kept perpetually underfed. Hunger was constant. Weakness was normal. A well-fed body might survive longer. A starved body burns out faster, and faster burnout meant faster turnover. Medical care followed the same logic. In places where enslaved people were expected to live for decades, medical intervention, however crude, was sometimes applied to preserve labor. In death-bound systems, care was minimal, inconsistent, or entirely absent. Why waste resources on bodies that were already accounted for as losses? This is where the idea of life expectancy by design becomes impossible to ignore. The system did not need precise predictions. It needed ranges. If people generally collapsed after a year or two under certain conditions, that was enough. Operations could be planned accordingly. Replacement schedules could be set. The system functioned smoothly as long as supply matched attrition, and supply for a long time was abundant. Another revealing detail lies in how enslaved people were categorized. Those sent into the most lethal environments were often described as new, unseasoned, or raw. Newly captured Africans were less acclimated, more susceptible to disease, less familiar with the terrain, less able to resist effectively. Their bodies could be pushed harder before collapsing. Their deaths were expected sooner. This made them ideal for systems that prioritized rapid extraction over long-term survival. The system knew this, it exploited it. Older enslaved people, children, or those already weakened by illness were often discarded entirely. Some were sent into punishment zones, others were simply left to die. The idea that every enslaved person was a valuable asset is a myth. Value was conditional, and once a person fell outside that condition, their survival no longer mattered. One of the most telling indicators of this design is how rarely enslavers expressed surprise at death. When people die unexpectedly, systems react. They investigate, they adjust, they question assumptions. But when death is expected, it barely registers. In letters and reports, deaths are mentioned briefly, if at all. The focus remains on output, supply, and cost. Mortality is treated as background information. This emotional flatness is not a lack of feeling, it is a sign of normalization. The system had learned to live with death, or rather to profit from it. It is also important to understand that these expectations were not static. They shifted depending on external pressures. When abolition movements disrupted the supply of enslaved people, suddenly life expectancy mattered. Suddenly reproduction was encouraged. Suddenly conditions improved in some regions, and not because morality had changed, but because economics had. This shift is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that conditions were adjustable all along. When death became inconvenient, the system adapted. When death was convenient, it was allowed. This tells us that the suffering endured by enslaved people was not simply the result of ignorance or incapacity. It was the result of choice. The system could calculate survival when it needed to. It chose not to when it didn't. Another layer of this design involved fear. Short life expectancy was not just an outcome. It was a tool. When people knew that certain assignments led to death, compliance increased elsewhere. The threat did not need to be spoken. It was understood. People worked harder to avoid being sent there. They obeyed to survive. The system used death not only as disposal, but as discipline. This made the entire structure more efficient. A small number of deaths could control a much larger population. And because those deaths occurred in isolated environments, they did not disrupt daily operations. This is how violence scales quietly. The psychological impact of this design cannot be overstated. Imagine living in a system where you know that your survival is conditional, not on behavior alone, but on assignment. Where you understand that certain places are final, where your body is measured not by age or health, but by how much more it can be forced to give. That knowledge reshapes how people think, resist, and endure. It also reshapes how history remembers, or forgets, them. People who die quickly leave fewer traces. They leave fewer descendants. They leave fewer records. Their absence makes it easier to deny intent later. This is one of the reasons these histories were softened after abolition. It was easier to speak about cruelty than calculation, easier to condemn brutality than to acknowledge design, because design implies responsibility. It implies that the system knew what it was doing, and that knowledge makes forgetting impossible. This scene matters because it exposes the quietest lie of all, that enslaved people died because conditions were harsh. A truth is harsher. Many enslaved people died because their deaths were already factored in. They were expected, they were tolerated, they were profitable. And when death is profitable, it stops being accidental. In the next scene, we will confront what happened when enslaved people resisted these systems. Not the romanticized version of resistance, But the reality of how resistance often led not to reform, but to elimination. Resistance is often remembered as rebellion, as defiance, as courage rising against impossible odds. That memory is not wrong, but it is incomplete, because within the system of slavery, resistance was not only punished, in many cases it was managed, sorted, redirected into spaces where resistance would end quietly and permanently. For enslaving systems built on control and efficiency, resistance posed a specific problem. It disrupted labor, it threatened authority, it risked contagion, because resistance spreads when it is seen to succeed. So the system learned how to deal with it, not always with spectacle, often with removal. The enslaved who resisted were not always killed publicly. Public executions drew attention, they could provoke unrest, they could create martyrs. Instead, many were sent away, sent to places where resistance could not survive. This is where extermination disguised itself as discipline. An enslaved person who resisted, who ran away, slowed work, spoke back, organized, or refused, was often labeled unmanageable. That label carried consequences. It meant the system no longer saw that person as worth reforming. And once a person was deemed unreformable, the question was no longer how to control them. The question became where to place them. The answer was rarely somewhere survivable. These people were reassigned to the harshest environments. Mines, swamps, remote camps, island zones of punishment where labor was extreme and oversight minimal. Officially, this was discipline. In practice, it was disposal. The system did not need to say, "This person will die." It only needed to send them somewhere death was likely. This method had several advantages. It removed a disruptive presence from the main workforce. It reinforced fear among those who remained, and it avoided the attention that overt killing might attract. The person disappeared, the lesson remained. This approach reveals something crucial about how slavery functioned. It was not only reactive, it was anticipatory. The system did not wait for resistance to escalate. It sorted people based on perceived risk and adjusted their conditions accordingly. Those considered compliant were kept where survival was more likely. Those considered dangerous were sent where survival was unlikely. Resistance in this sense became a death sentence, not through execution, but through assignment. And this assignment was not random. Patterns appear across regions and time periods. Enslaved people punished for resistance are disproportionately represented in the most lethal labor environments. Their mortality rates were higher, their life expectancy shorter. This was not coincidence. It was policy without paperwork. Another layer of this system involved timing. Resistance was most common among newly captured people. They had not yet been broken by the system. They still carried expectations of freedom, dignity, autonomy. The system understood this. New arrivals were watched closely. Those who resisted early were often removed quickly before their defiance could influence others. They were sent away, and once sent, they rarely returned. This early removal served a dual purpose. It punished resistance and accelerated the normalization of compliance among those who remained. The message was clear, even if unspoken. Resistance leads somewhere worse. The fear this created cannot be overstated. Imagine living in a system where you know that resistance does not always bring lashes or imprisonment, but disappearance, where people who defy authority are simply gone, where you hear whispers of where they were sent and what happened to those who went before them. That fear shapes behavior more effectively than constant violence. It turns survival into obedience. It also turns obedience into a strategy rather than a surrender. People complied not because they believed in the system, but because they understood the cost of defiance. This is how exterminatory logic spreads quietly. Another form of resistance the system feared was organization. Enslaved people did not need weapons to threaten the system. They needed coordination, communication, shared intent. This is why gatherings were monitored, why movement was restricted, why people from the same regions or language groups were often separated, and when organization did occur, when enslaved people planned revolts, shared information, or coordinated slowdowns, the response was swift. The leaders were identified and then removed again. Removal did not always mean execution. It meant reassignment to conditions that made survival unlikely. This strategy was effective precisely because it was quiet. It did not create mass outrage. It did not require justification. It simply made problems vanish. Over time, this produced a chilling effect. Enslaved communities learned to self-police, to discourage overt resistance that might draw attention, to survive by minimizing visibility. This survival strategy, while necessary, had long-term consequences. It limited the kinds of resistance that could be remembered later. Quiet survival leaves fewer stories than open rebellion, and that absence shaped historical memory. Later generations would ask, why didn't they resist more? Without understanding that resistance often led not to heroic narratives, but to annihilation. Another category of resistance involved refusal. Refusal to work at full capacity, refusal to comply fully, refusal to internalize subjugation. These forms of resistance were harder to punish openly, but no less threatening. The system responded by intensifying conditions. Workloads increased, rations decreased, surveillance tightened, and if the person did not break, they were moved to where breaking was inevitable. This escalation reveals something important. The system was not interested in justice. It was interested in resolution, and resolution did not require survival. It required compliance or elimination. Women who resisted faced additional dangers. Resistance through refusal, through protecting children, through maintaining cultural practices, was often labeled insubordination. Pregnancy did not protect women from punishment. In some systems, pregnant women were forced into labor environments that endangered both them and their unborn children. This was not oversight, it was indifference. Children, too, were not spared. Older children who resisted or disrupted labor routines were punished harshly. Some were separated from families and reassigned. Others were sent into environments far beyond their capacity. The idea that children were protected within slavery is another comforting myth. Protection was conditional, and conditions were defined by utility. When resistance made someone inconvenient, age no longer mattered. What makes this scene especially difficult is recognizing how effective this system was. It did not rely on constant terror. It relied on targeted disappearance. A few visible examples were enough to shape behavior across entire populations. This efficiency is why the system endured for so long, and why its most lethal aspects remained hidden. Because death did not always arrive dramatically, it arrived administratively. It arrived through reassignment orders, through transfers, through silence. And silence, as always, made forgetting easier. This is why records often fail to capture resistance fully. People who resisted and were sent to die left fewer traces. They did not live long enough to leave testimonies. They did not leave descendants to carry memory forward. Their absence became part of the system's success. This is also why later histories often portray enslaved people as passive, not because they were, but because the system was designed to erase those who resisted most visibly. What survives in the archive is not the full range of resistance. It is what the system allowed to survive. Understanding this forces us to rethink the moral landscape of slavery. Resistance was not a simple choice between courage and fear. It was a calculation between different forms of death. Some resisted openly and disappeared quickly. Some resisted quietly and survived longer. Some complied outwardly while resisting internally. None of these choices were free. All of them were constrained by a system that punished defiance with elimination. This is why the story of resistance must be told alongside the story of extermination, because without that context, resistance looks rare. With that context, resistance looks constant and devastatingly costly. In the next scene, we will confront one of the most uncomfortable truths of all. What happened to those whose bodies were deemed useless? Not because they resisted, but because they aged, fell ill, became pregnant, or could no longer meet the system's demands. Because in a system where value is measured by output, usefulness has an expiration date. And when that date passes, the outcome is often the same. In a system where human value is measured by output, usefulness always has an expiration date. It does not arrive suddenly, it creeps in through injury, through illness, through pregnancy, through exhaustion that no amount of rest can undo. And when usefulness ends, protection ends with it. One of the most enduring myths about slavery is that enslaved people were always considered valuable property, too valuable to waste. That belief comforts modern audiences. It suggests limits. It implies restraint. But the records tell a different story. Enslaved people were not valued equally. They were valued conditionally. As long as a body could produce, it mattered. When it could not, its value collapsed. This is where the logic of disposability becomes impossible to ignore. In systems designed for rapid extraction, usefulness was measured narrowly: strength, speed, endurance, obedience. Once any of these declined, the system recalculated. Older enslaved people were among the first to feel this shift. Aging bodies could not sustain extreme labor. Injuries took longer to heal. Illness lingered, productivity declined gradually, then sharply. In long-term plantation systems, older enslaved people were sometimes reassigned to lighter tasks, not out of compassion, but because replacement was inconvenient. But in the death-bound systems we've been examining, there was no room for reassignment. There were only two categories: useful, expendable. Once an enslaved person slipped into the second category, their fate was often sealed. They were not retired, they were removed. Removal could mean transfer to harsher labor environments. It could mean abandonment. It could mean neglect so severe that death followed quickly. The system did not need to kill them directly. It only needed to stop caring. Illness reveals this logic with brutal clarity. In environments where survival was not prioritized, sickness was treated as a liability. Medical care was minimal, sometimes non-existent. Once illness interfered with work, the person was seen as a drain on resources. Food was withheld. Rest was denied. Labor continued until collapse. And when collapse came, it was not treated as tragedy. It was treated as resolution. Pregnancy exposes another layer of this disposability. In some enslaving systems, pregnancy was encouraged because children meant future labor. But that encouragement only existed where long-term survival mattered. In death-bound systems, pregnancy was a problem. Pregnant women could not work at maximum capacity. They required additional food. They needed rest. Their labor output declined. From the system's perspective, this made them inefficient, so pregnancy did not offer protection. In many cases, pregnant women were forced to continue heavy labor until miscarriage or collapse. Some lost their lives, some lost their children, some lost both. The system did not intervene, because intervention would have required acknowledging value beyond labor, and that acknowledgement would have undermined the logic holding everything together. Children, too, were subject to this calculus. Very young children were often seen as future labor, but only if survival seemed likely. In the most lethal environments, children represented delayed returns. They consumed food, they required care, they did not produce immediately. In these systems, children were not investments, they were burdens. Some were abandoned, some were neglected, some were sent into labor far beyond their capacity. Again, this was not chaos, it was prioritization. One of the most disturbing aspects of this logic is how quietly it operated. There were no declarations that certain people were no longer worth saving. There did not need to be. The system communicated value through action, through who received food and who did not, through who was assigned survivable work and who was sent away, through who was treated and who was ignored. People learned quickly where they stood. Imagine the psychological weight of that knowledge, knowing that your survival depends not on humanity, but on usefulness. Knowing that injury is not just pain, but a sentence, knowing that aging is not natural but dangerous. This awareness shaped behavior profoundly. Enslaved people pushed themselves beyond their limits, not because they believed in the work, but because they feared what would happen if they slowed. They hid injuries, they worked through illness, they suppressed pain. Not out of resilience alone, out of terror. The system relied on this fear. It extracted value not only from bodies, but from anxiety. And when fear was no longer enough, when a body truly could not continue, the system did not adjust, it replaced. What makes this particularly difficult to confront is that these outcomes were not seen as failures by those in power. They were seen as natural consequences of a system optimized for efficiency. Enslavers often spoke about wear and tear the way one might speak about tools. A body that broke down was no different from equipment that wore out. This language was not metaphorical, it was operational. It allowed people to distance themselves emotionally from what they were doing. After all, tools do not suffer, tools do not grieve, tools do not remember. But people do, and those memories survived even when bodies did not. Within enslaved communities, people understood the hierarchy of usefulness. They knew who was protected and who was vulnerable. They knew which conditions offered a chance of survival and which did not. This knowledge shaped social bonds. People cared for one another, quietly, shared food when they could, hid the sick, protected the pregnant when possible. These acts did not dismantle the system, but they resisted its logic. They asserted that value existed beyond productivity. That assertion was dangerous, because it contradicted the foundation of enslavement. This is another reason these stories rarely appear in mainstream histories. They expose how thoroughly the system reduced people to functions, and they expose how completely that reduction failed to erase humanity. Even as the system categorized bodies as useful or useless, enslaved people continued to care, remember, and resist in ways that left no official record. Those who were deemed useless often vanished without documentation. No death certificates, no burial records, no names preserved. They disappeared into the margins, and those margins became silence. This silence allowed later generations to imagine a version of slavery that was cruel but bounded, violent but restrained, exploitative but not exterminatory. But the silence is not evidence of mercy, it is evidence of erasure, because people who are deemed useless leave fewer traces. They die quietly, they are replaced quickly, they are forgotten easily. Understanding this forces a re-evaluation of what slavery actually was. Not just a system of forced labor, but a system that sorted human beings by usefulness and discarded those who fell short. That truth is uncomfortable because it reveals how deeply modern ideas of productivity value and disposability are rooted in this past, and because it raises a question that still resonates. What happens to people when systems decide they are no longer useful? In the next scene, we will turn to the records, not to find compassion, but to see how this logic appears in numbers, ledgers, and archives. Because even when the system tried to hide its intentions, it left traces. And those traces tell a story that words alone cannot. When a system wants to hide what it is doing, it rarely destroys all evidence. It doesn't need to. It simply records reality in a language that avoids responsibility. Slavery did exactly that. The archives that remain: ledgers, shipping manifests, plantation logs, correspondence, do not scream, they do not confess, they do not describe suffering in human terms, they count. And it is in that counting that the truth survives. The records of slavery were never meant to preserve memory. They were meant to preserve control, to track assets, to calculate profit, to ensure efficiency. Human lives appear in them the way livestock or equipment does, as entries, figures, fluctuations. Names are inconsistent, ages are approximate, causes of death are vague. What matters is not who died, what matters is how many remain. This is why the archives are so revealing, not because they are explicit, but because they are indifferent. You see it first in shipping records. Ships arrive with a certain number of enslaved people. Months later, inventories show fewer. The gap is not explained. There is no panic, no investigation. The next entry lists replacements. This pattern repeats, loss followed by replenishment, again and again. If death were unexpected, it would disrupt the record. It would demand explanation. It would prompt concern, but it doesn't, because death is assumed. Plantation journals tell a similar story. They track daily labor output, weather conditions, harvest yields, occasional punishments. Rarely do they dwell on mortality. Deaths are noted briefly, if at all. Several lost to illness. Labor reduced this week. Additional hands required. These phrases appear across regions and decades. They are not anomalies. They are templates. The language reveals a mindset where death is not a moral event, but an operational one. And when something is operational, it becomes invisible. One of the most telling features of these records is what they do not contain. They do not record grief. They do not record family loss. They do not record the psychological impact of constant death. Because none of that mattered to the system. What mattered was continuity of production. This absence of humanity is not neutral. It is evidence when a system consistently omits the same kinds of information. It tells you what it values and what it does not. Another quiet truth emerges when you compare different regions. In areas where enslaved people were expected to survive longer, records are more detailed, births are noted, family units are tracked, ages are estimated more carefully. In death-bound systems, this detail disappears. People enter the record briefly and then vanish, no explanation, no follow-up. Just absence. This absence is not accidental. It reflects the system's expectations. Why invest in detailed record keeping for people not expected to last? Why track names when turnover is constant? Why document lives when the system is designed to consume them? The archives answer these questions through silence. Financial records are even more revealing. Expenses related to enslaved people are carefully itemized. Purchase cost, transport, basic maintenance. Medical expenses are minimal. Burial costs, when they appear at all, are negligible. Replacement costs, however, are planned. They appear regularly. This tells us something crucial. The system did not see death as extraordinary. It saw it as routine. Replacement was not an emergency measure. It was part of the budget. This budgetary acceptance of death is one of the strongest indicators of design. You do not plan for something you do not expect. You do not normalize costs that are accidental. The records also show how enslavers discussed mortality among themselves, rarely with horror, often with annoyance. Deaths were inconvenient when they disrupted schedules or increased expenses. They were regrettable only when they reduced profit margins. Even then, the response was not to question the system, but to optimize it, increase supply, adjust workloads, change locations, never reconsider the premise. This is where the myth of ignorance fails. These people were not blind. They were attentive. They noticed patterns. They made adjustments. They chose not to intervene in ways that would preserve life when those interventions conflicted with profit. That choice is documented, not in emotional language, in numbers. The most unsettling aspect of these records is how normal they appear. There is nothing dramatic about a ledger, nothing shocking about a balance sheet. That normality is what allowed this system to persist, because evil that looks ordinary is harder to confront than evil that looks monstrous. This is also why later generations struggled to read these records honestly. Numbers feel neutral, they feel objective, but numbers are shaped by what is counted and what is ignored. And in the records of slavery, what is ignored is suffering, what is ignored is intention. What is ignored is death as a moral fact. Instead, death is rendered as a fluctuation, a variance, a statistic. This rendering made it easier to forget, and forgetting served those who inherited the wealth built on this system. After abolition, these records became awkward. They did not align with emerging narratives of progress and reform, so they were reframed. Mortality was blamed on disease, on climate, on mismanagement, anything but design. The archives were not destroyed, they were reinterpreted, and reinterpretation can be as powerful as erasure. Histories were written that emphasized cruelty without calculation, brutality without planning, violence without system. This allowed societies to condemn slavery while distancing themselves from its logic. But the records do not allow that distance if read carefully. They show a system that understood its impact and proceeded anyway. They show that death was not hidden from those in charge. It was simply deprioritized. This is why reading these records today is such a quiet, devastating experience. There are no confessions to point to, no villains to isolate, only patterns. And patterns reveal intent more reliably than words. The people who died in these systems often left no written testimony. They were denied literacy, denied time, denied survival. But the system that killed them wrote obsessively, and in its writing, it told the truth it could never say out loud, that enslaved people were not just exploited, they were expended. The archives do not cry, but they do not lie. They show a world where human destruction was integrated into economic planning and treated as acceptable. Understanding this forces a reckoning, not just with the past, but with how we read history. Because if we only look for cruelty in dramatic moments, we miss the cruelty embedded in routine, and it is routine cruelty that endures the longest. In the next scene, we will confront why this truth was softened after abolition and how the need to protect national myths reshaped memory. Because once slavery ended on paper, its most uncomfortable truths had to be buried, not destroyed, just made easier to ignore. When slavery officially ended, the violence did not simply disappear. What disappeared first was language. The systems that had depended on exhaustion, attrition, and replacement did not want to explain themselves. They wanted continuity of wealth, of status, of legitimacy, and continuity required a story that could be lived with. So the past was rewritten, not erased completely, just adjusted enough to feel tolerable. This is how the most lethal truths of slavery slipped out of public memory, not through denial, but through softening. After abolition, societies faced a problem. The wealth that powered nations, industries, and families had been built on a system that could not be defended morally in a changing world. The brutality was obvious. The suffering was undeniable, but the design, the planning, the calculation, the acceptance of death was harder to admit, because design implies intent, and intent implies responsibility. So the narrative shifted. Slavery became a story of cruelty rather than structure, of bad individuals rather than efficient systems, of excess rather than purpose. This shift allowed societies to condemn slavery while preserving their foundations. It also allowed them to avoid difficult questions. Questions like, why were certain regions so deadly? Why did enslaved populations fail to reproduce in some places? Why did death rates drop only when replacement became difficult? Answering those questions honestly would have forced an uncomfortable conclusion that death had not been accidental. So the questions were avoided. Instead, history leaned on safer explanations. Climate was blamed, disease was blamed. Harsh conditions became the catch-all phrase that required no follow-up. Harsh conditions sound tragic but impersonal. They suggest inevitability. They remove agency. They allow people to say, it was terrible, without asking, why was it allowed to be terrible? This linguistic softening was not limited to textbooks. It happened in law, in politics, in family histories, and in national memory. Former enslavers reframed themselves as products of their time. As participants in a flawed system they did not fully understand. The idea that they knew, that they calculated death and built around it, was pushed aside. Because knowledge is harder to forgive than ignorance. Another reason this history was softened lies in how abolition itself was framed. Abolition is often remembered as a moral awakening, a moment when societies suddenly recognized the humanity of enslaved people and corrected a wrong. That narrative is comforting. It suggests progress, but it obscures the reality that abolition was driven as much by economic shifts, political pressure, and fear of rebellion as by morality. If abolition had been purely moral, the transition would have included accountability. It did not. There were no trials for those who ran death-bound system, no reparations for those whose lives were consumed, no reckoning with the design of extermination. Instead, enslavers were compensated. And compensation requires justification. You do not compensate criminals, you compensate legitimate actors who suffered loss. So the system had to be reframed as flawed but lawful, cruel but not criminal, harsh but not intentional. This reframing required minimizing the most damning aspects of slavery. The places where people were worked to death could not be central to the story. They had to become footnotes or disappear entirely. Another factor in this softening was the nature of evidence. The people most affected by exterminatory systems left the fewest records. They died quickly. They had no opportunity to testify. Their communities were shattered before memory could consolidate. What survived were the records of the system itself. And those records, as we've seen, spoke in numbers, not narratives. Later historians, trained to privilege written sources, leaned heavily on these documents. But without reading between the lines, the intent remained hidden. Mortality rates became data points. Replacement schedules became logistics. The absence of explicit admissions of intent was mistaken for the absence of intent itself. This is a critical error systems rarely confess. They reveal themselves through patterns. But patterns require interpretation, and interpretation is shaped by context, values, and willingness. For a long time, there was little willingness to confront what these patterns implied, because doing so would have disrupted foundational myths. Myths about benevolent empires, myths about civilizing missions, myths about progress. Colonial powers in particular had invested heavily in portraying themselves as agents of order and development. Acknowledging that they had operated systems designed to consume human life would have shattered that image. So colonial violence was reframed as unfortunate excess. Individual cruelty replaced structural design. Bad apples replaced bad systems. This allowed nations to move forward without looking back too closely. It also allowed them to retain the benefits of slavery without inheriting its guilt. Another reason this history faded lies in discomfort. The idea that people were worked to death by design is not just disturbing, it is destabilizing. It forces a reconsideration of how modern systems value human life, because the logic that made death acceptable then, efficiency, productivity, disposability, did not vanish with slavery. It evolved. Acknowledging exterminatory slavery means acknowledging a lineage, one that connects past exploitation to present inequalities. That connection is politically inconvenient. It raises questions about wealth accumulation, global disparities, and systemic injustice. Questions that many societies prefer not to answer. So the past was simplified. Slavery became a moral failure corrected by abolition. The story ended there, but for those who look closely, the ending never made sense, because the consequences persisted. Economic disparities did not disappear. Social hierarchies remained intact. The descendants of enslaved people continued to face structural barriers. These outcomes suggest continuity, not rupture. They suggest that something deeper than cruelty was at work, that something was design, and design leaves legacies. Another layer of softening occurred through education. Textbooks favored narratives that could be taught quickly and safely. Slavery was often reduced to a chapter, a prelude to progress. The most uncomfortable details were omitted: death camps, exterminatory labor zones, replacement economies. These did not fit neatly into standardized curricula. They raised questions educators were not equipped or willing to address, so they were excluded. This exclusion was not always malicious. Sometimes it was pragmatic. But pragmatism has consequences. When generations grow up without understanding the full scope of slavery, they inherit incomplete frameworks. They struggle to grasp why trauma persists, why distrust endures, why inequality feels entrenched. Without understanding design, suffering looks accidental. And accidental suffering is easier to dismiss. Another reason this history was softened is that it challenges the idea of progress itself. If slavery included systems designed for death, then progress is not just a story of moral improvement. It is also a story of selective memory. That realization threatens how societies undo themselves. It complicates pride, it undermines innocence. So the story is adjusted, not erased, just reshaped. The result is a version of history that condemns slavery without fully understanding it, that acknowledges brutality without confronting structure, that mourns victims without naming responsibility. This is why telling this story now matters, not to assign guilt retroactively, but to restore accuracy. Because accuracy is a form of respect, and because without accuracy, the past remains unresolved. The softening of this history did not happen once. It happens continuously, every time a discussion of slavery avoids economics, every time death is framed as collateral rather than central, every time resistance is romanticized without acknowledging the cost. Each omission reinforces the lie that slavery was brutal, but bounded. It was not, it was expansive, adaptive, calculated. And its most lethal forms were buried because they were too revealing. In the final scenes, we will move from history into consequence. We will examine how this design shaped the world that followed, and why understanding it is not about the past alone. Because systems that once learned to treat people as expendable do not simply forget that lesson, they pass it on. When we talk about systems designed to consume human beings, it is easy to focus on those who did not survive. But survival in this context was not an escape from harm. It was a different form of injury. The people who lived through death-bound systems did not simply walk away when slavery ended. They carried the imprint of that design in their bodies, their minds, and their communities, and that imprint did not fade quickly, it settled. One of the most misunderstood aspects of slavery is the assumption that survival meant resilience without damage, that those who endured were somehow hardened, able to move on once freedom arrived. This assumption is comforting. It is also false survival under a system that treats death as acceptable, rewires how a person understands the world. It reshapes how they interpret safety, value, and trust. Imagine living in a reality where your worth is recalculated constantly, where every injury feels like a threat, where slowing down could mean reassignment to a place you know people do not return from, that awareness does not disappear when chains are removed. It becomes internal. Survivors learn to read danger everywhere in tone, in posture, in small shifts of authority. Hypervigilance was not a disorder, it was a survival skill. But skills developed under terror do not turn off easily. After slavery, many survivors struggled to feel secure, even in moments of relative freedom. They had learned that systems could change without warning, that conditions could worsen suddenly, that survival was never guaranteed. This uncertainty created a deep psychological residue. Trust was difficult, authority was feared, stability felt temporary. Another cost of survival was guilt, not because survivors had done something wrong, but because survival itself felt arbitrary. People watched others disappear, siblings, friends, partners sent to harsher environments, or worked until they collapsed. Those who remained often asked themselves why them, why not me? This kind of guilt is not rational, but it is powerful. It lingers quietly, it complicates grief. Many survivors did not have the space to mourn properly. Grief requires safety, it requires time, it requires acknowledgement. Slavery provided none of these. Death was frequent, loss was constant, and public mourning was often discouraged or punished. To grieve openly was to risk appearing unproductive or defiant. So grief went underground. It was carried silently, passed down indirectly. This is one reason trauma persisted across generations, even when the original events were not spoken about openly. Silence does not erase pain, it transmits it. The design of exterminatory systems also fractured community bonds. Constant reassignment, high mortality, and fear of disappearance made long-term relationships fragile. People learned not to attach too deeply, not to plan far ahead, not to imagine futures that could be taken away overnight. These coping mechanisms helped people survive in the moment, but they also limited the ability to rebuild afterward. When slavery ended, survivors were expected to suddenly operate in a world that required long-term planning, trust in institutions, and confidence in personal value. But those capacities had been systematically undermined. This mismatch created lasting psychological strain. Children born to survivors inherited this environment. Even when they were not enslaved themselves, they grew up around adults shaped by fear, loss, and caution. They absorbed lessons about danger and disposability indirectly, through behavior, silence, and unspoken rules. Don't attract attention. Don't assume protection. These messages were rarely taught explicitly, they were lived. This is how trauma travels without words. Another consequence of exterminatory slavery was the erosion of self-concept. When a system consistently treats people as replaceable, it shapes how they see themselves. Even resistance does not fully protect against this internalization. Survivors often struggled with feelings of worthlessness, not because they believed the system was right, but because they had been forced to operate within it for so long. It takes time to rebuild a sense of inherent value after living under a system that denied it daily, and that time was rarely afforded. After abolition, survivors were expected to become productive citizens immediately, to work, to comply, to integrate into societies that had profited from their suffering. There was little acknowledgement of what they had endured, no collective healing, no recognition of psychological harm. The system moved on. The people did not. This lack of acknowledgement compounded the damage. Trauma, unrecognized, becomes trauma unresolved. And unresolved trauma does not remain contained. It manifests in stress, distrust, anger, withdrawal, and survival strategies that make sense in dangerous environments but are misunderstood in safer ones. Communities built by survivors often carried this tension. They were resilient, resourceful, and deeply bonded, but also guarded, wary, and shaped by loss. These traits are often misinterpreted by outsiders as cultural flaws rather than survival adaptations. That misinterpretation adds another layer of harm. It blames survivors for the consequences of what was done to them. The psychological cost of exterminatory systems is also visible in how history was remembered or not remembered within families. Many survivors did not tell their stories, not because they forgot, but because the memories were too heavy, or because they believed no one would listen, or because speaking could reopen wounds they had learned to seal just to function. This silence protected individuals in the short term, but it left later generations with fragments, feelings without explanations, anxieties without clear origins. This is one reason historical recovery matters, not to reopen wounds carelessly, but to give context to pain that has long existed without narrative. Understanding design changes how trauma is interpreted. It shifts the focus from individual weakness to systemic harm, from pathology to history. This reframing is not academic. It is necessary, because without it, survivors and their descendants are left carrying burdens they are told are personal failures, rather than inherited consequences. Another overlooked cost of survival was the narrowing of imagination. In systems where the future was uncertain or short, dreaming too far ahead was dangerous. Hope had to be rationed. People learned to focus on immediate survival rather than long-term aspiration. This orientation did not disappear overnight. It influenced how communities approached risk, opportunity, and trust in promises of progress. These patterns are often criticized without being understood, but when you trace them back to exterminatory systems, they make sense. They are not signs of incapacity. They are signs of adaptation. What makes this especially important is recognizing that psychological harm was not accidental. It was a byproduct of a system that relied on fear, uncertainty, and disposability to function. Even those who survived were meant to be shaped, to be cautious, to be compliant, to be fragmented. The system did not need to destroy everyone physically. It needed to break enough people psychologically to sustain control. This is why survival is not the end of the story. It is part of the damage, and this damage did not end with abolition. It flowed into the world that followed, into labor systems that continued to devalue certain lives, into social structures that treated some communities as expendable, into narratives that blamed individuals for outcomes rooted in design. Understanding this psychological legacy is essential because it explains why the effects of slavery did not vanish when laws changed. It explains why inequality persisted. It explains why healing has been so slow. In the next scene, we will move from the internal to the structural. We will examine how exterminatory slavery shaped modern inequality, economically, politically, and socially, and why its logic still echoes today. Because systems that once learned how to profit from disposability rarely abandon that lesson completely. When slavery ended, the system did not collapse, it transformed. The chains were removed, but the logic that justified them did not disappear. It adapted, quietly, efficiently, into new structures that carried the same assumptions forward. That is the part of this history most people struggle to accept, not because it is abstract, but because it is familiar. The idea that some lives are more expendable than others did not originate with slavery, but slavery refined it, standardized it, and proved how profitable it could be. And once a system learns that lesson, it rarely forgets. The exterminatory logic of slavery did not vanish when laws changed. It embedded itself into the foundations of modern economies, labor systems, and global power structures. You can see it first in wealth. The regions that benefited most from slavery did not simply accumulate money. They accumulated infrastructure, political influence, and institutional stability. Ports were built, banks expanded, insurance industries grew. Entire financial systems matured on the back of enslaved labor. Meanwhile, the regions that supplied that labor were drained. Not just of people, but of time. Generations were removed from productive life. Communities were fractured. Knowledge systems were disrupted. Population growth was distorted. This was not a temporary setback. It was a structural disadvantage built over centuries. And when slavery ended, there was no reset. Those who had been worked to death left no wealth behind. Those who survived were released into systems designed without them in mind. No land redistribution, no compensation, no institutional support. Freedom arrived without resources. This imbalance hardened inequality. Former enslaving societies moved forward with capital, networks, and political leverage intact. Formerly enslaved communities were expected to compete in the same economic space without the same foundations. That expectation was not neutral. It was built on the assumption that outcomes were individual rather than systemic. This assumption allowed inequality to persist without acknowledgement of its origins. Another place the logic endured was labor. After slavery, new labor systems emerged that echoed old patterns: sharecropping, indentured labor, penal labor, colonial labor regimes. These systems maintained a familiar hierarchy. Certain groups were assigned the most dangerous, exhausting, and poorly compensated work. Safety was minimal. Replacement was easy. The calculus remained the same. If a body broke down, another could take its place. This continuity was not accidental, it was efficient. The people designing post-slavery economies were often the same people, or their descendants, who had benefited from slavery. They carried forward assumptions about labor value, risk tolerance, and disposability. The difference was language. Where slavery had been explicit, the new systems were bureaucratic. Contracts replaced chains, debt replaced ownership, punishment replaced sale, but the outcomes were often strikingly similar: high mortality in certain industries, low wages, minimal protections, little accountability. These patterns persist today. Industries that rely on hazardous labor still disproportionately draw from communities historically marked as expendable. Environmental dangers, unsafe working conditions, and health risks cluster where political power is weakest. This is not coincidence, it is legacy. Another inheritance of exterminatory slavery is political. Communities descended from enslaved populations entered political systems that had never been designed to include them. Voting restrictions, property requirements, policing practices. These barriers did not emerge randomly. They were tools to maintain hierarchies established under slavery, and they were justified using familiar arguments. Claims about productivity, claims about order, claims about readiness. The same logic that once justified sending people to die quietly now justified excluding them quietly. What changed was visibility. The system became less overt, but no less effective. Education reveals another layer of continuity. Access to education has always been a pathway to mobility. Under slavery, education was denied outright. After slavery, it was restricted indirectly. Underfunded schools, segregation, limited access to higher education. These barriers ensured that inequality reproduced itself. They also ensured that the history of exterminatory systems remained underexplored, because education shapes memory, and memory shapes accountability. When people are taught sanitized versions of the past, they struggle to understand the present. Inequality appears natural, poverty appears personal, disparities appear inevitable. The design disappears. Another enduring impact lies in global inequality. The wealth extracted through slavery and colonial exploitation helped industrialize certain parts of the world while underdeveloping others. This created global power imbalances that still shape trade, debt, and political influence. Countries that were once sources of labor and resources now navigate international systems stacked against them. Their challenges are often framed as internal failures, rarely as historical consequences. This framing allows exploitation to continue in new forms: cheap labor markets, resource extraction, debt dependency. The same regions that once supplied bodies now supply raw materials and labor under conditions that prioritize efficiency over human cost. Again, the logic persists. Another subtle inheritance of exterminatory slavery is how societies measure worth. Productivity remains a dominant value. People are often judged by output rather than humanity. Those who cannot produce due to illness, disability, age, or circumstance are marginalized. Support systems are limited. Safety nets are fragile. Care is conditional. This mindset did not originate with slavery, but slavery normalized it at scale. It taught systems how to function without regard for those deemed unproductive. And that lesson lingers. Even discussions about modern inequality often avoid moral language. They focus on numbers, on growth, on efficiency. This mirrors the archival logic of slavery. People become data points again. Loss becomes acceptable when it can be rationalized. This continuity does not mean modern systems are identical to slavery. They are not. But it does mean that slavery shaped how systems learned to operate. It established templates for extraction, templates for control, templates for erasure. Understanding this does not require assigning blame to individuals today. It requires acknowledging inheritance. The world we live in did not appear fully formed. It was built, and parts of that foundation were laid using systems that treated human beings as expendable. That history explains why inequality feels so entrenched, because it was engineered, not in a single moment, but across generations. This is why confronting exterminatory slavery matters now, not as an academic exercise, but as a lens. It allows us to see modern systems more clearly, to recognize patterns of disposability when they appear, to question narratives that frame suffering as accidental or deserved, and to ask better questions like, who benefits when certain lives are treated as cheap? Who absorbs the cost when systems prioritize efficiency over humanity? And what would it take to redesign systems around dignity rather than output? These questions are uncomfortable. They should be. Because comfort has always been the ally of forgetting. In the final scene, we will return to the present, to memory, to responsibility, to what it means to tell this story now, and what happens if we choose not to. There is a temptation when a story reaches this point to offer closure, to end with reassurance, to soften the weight, to suggest that understanding the past is enough to put it behind us. But history does not work that way, especially not this history. The people who were worked to death by design did not vanish because they were forgotten. They were forgotten because they were made to vanish. That distinction matters, because forgetting was not an accident of time. It was the final stage of the system. The system first reduced people to labor, then to output, then to losses, and finally to silence. What remains is not just absence, but an unanswered responsibility. Remembering, in this context, is not about nostalgia or moral performance. It is not about feeling sad for a moment and moving on. It is about accuracy, and accuracy is disruptive. To remember honestly is to refuse the softened version of the past, the version that condemns cruelty while excusing design, the version that mourns suffering without naming intent. Honest remembrance forces a reckoning with how thoroughly normalized human destruction once was, and how easily it was justified. The people who ran these systems did not see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as managers, administrators, investors, participants in an economy that rewarded efficiency and punished hesitation. That self-image is important because it reminds us that systems capable of immense harm rarely announce themselves as evil. They present themselves as necessary, as rational, as unavoidable. This is why remembrance is not just backward-looking. It is diagnostic. It teaches us how to recognize danger when it appears in new forms, when people are described primarily by their productivity, when suffering is reframed as cost, when death is treated as acceptable loss, when entire groups are quietly designated as expendable. These are not relics of the past. They are warning signs. The people who were worked to death by design were not given the dignity of being remembered as individuals. Their names were rarely recorded. Their stories were rarely preserved. Their deaths were absorbed into ledgers and budgets. But anonymity does not erase humanity. It only reveals how hard the system worked to deny it. What remembering actually means is restoring context where silence once existed. It means understanding that the absence of voices is not evidence of passivity, but of erasure, that the lack of testimony does not imply acceptance, but prevention. It also means resisting the urge to isolate this history as exceptional. The exterminatory aspects of slavery were not aberrations. They were extensions of a logic that prioritized output over life. That logic did not end. It changed vocabulary, it changed visibility, but it remains familiar. This is why some people react defensively to stories like this. Not because they are untrue, but because they unsettle comfortable narratives. They challenge the idea that progress is linear. They complicate the belief that moral clarity arrived naturally. They suggest that systems improve not because they are corrected, but because they are pressured. That realization is unsettling, because it implies responsibility does not end with acknowledgement. It continues with vigilance. Remembering, then, is an active process. It requires asking uncomfortable questions about how value is assigned today, about whose lives are protected by policy and whose are exposed to risk, about which deaths provoke outrage and which are quietly absorbed. It requires noticing patterns. Who performs the most dangerous labor? Who lives near environmental hazards? Who is most easily replaced? Who is most easily ignored? These questions echo the past because they are shaped by it. Remembering also means resisting simplification. The people who were worked to death were not only victims, they were thinkers, they were caregivers, they were strategists. They were resistors, often in ways the archive cannot capture. Their lives cannot be reduced to how they died, but their deaths cannot be dismissed as incidental. Holding both truths at once is difficult. It requires maturity, it requires restraint, it requires a willingness to sit with discomfort rather than rush toward resolution. This is why telling this story now matters, not because it changes what happened, but because it changes what is allowed to be forgotten. Every system depends on selective memory, on deciding which histories are essential and which are optional. The history of people worked to death by design was treated as optional. For a long time, too inconvenient, too destabilizing, too revealing, but optional histories have consequences. They leave gaps in understanding. They distort conversations about inequality. They weaken our ability to recognize harm when it reappears. This film does not ask for guilt. It asks for clarity. Clarity about how systems operate when human life is subordinated to efficiency. Clarity about how easily death becomes acceptable when it is distributed unevenly. Clarity about how forgetting becomes a form of continuation, because forgetting allows patterns to repeat without recognition. And recognition is the first interruption. The people who were consumed by these systems did not have the power to record their own histories. They were denied time, safety, and voice. What we have now is not their testimony, but the trace of what was done to them. Reading those traces, honestly, is a form of respect. It acknowledges that their deaths were not meaningless. They reveal something essential about how power operates, and about how fragile humanity becomes when systems are allowed to define value without accountability. The question this story leaves us with is not comfortable, it is necessary. If a society once accepted that certain people could be worked to death by design, quietly, profitably, and without consequence, what prevents similar logic from returning in new forms? The answer is not morality alone, it is memory, but not passive memory, the kind that interrogates systems rather than individuals, the kind that notices patterns rather than exceptions, the kind that refuses to let silence complete the work of erasure. That is what remembering actually means. Not closure, not comfort, but vigilance, because history does not repeat itself exactly. It adapts, and only those who understand its design can recognize it when it appears again. This story ends here, but its implications do not. They live in the present, and what we choose to remember next will determine what we are willing to accept. That choice is not historical, it is ongoing, and it belongs to us.